Oh, when we start to hating people, then we get in the same fix that they are in.
The most creative civil rights movement in America happened in Mississippi.
They liked their way of life. They were not going to accept integration.
The Citizens Council comes and warns him, you either cut this out or we're going to shut you down.
Belzoni preacher killed in odd accident.
That is when you saw the type of terror that was visited upon George Lee.
I was just in shock almost. It was just terrible. It was just a nightmare.
It was the spring of 1955 in Belzoni, Mississippi, less than a year after Brown versus Board of Education had rocked the nation, putting an end to segregation in public schools. The Reverend George W. Lee, a bold civil rights activist who was tired of being disenfranchised, led a courageous campaign to register black voters. Until this day, the crime against Reverend George Lee remains a civil rights cold case, unprosecuted and unsolved. This is murder in black and white.
The deliberately misnamed Civil Rights Bill is a force bill.
There is no justifiable reason for discrimination.
This attempt to destroy the American Constitution
can never be satisfied long as our children are robbed of their dignity.
We also recognize the Negro, and when he stays in his place, we shall stay in ours.
The White Citizens Council controlled what was going on in North Mississippi. Anything in South Mississippi was the Klan. These people meant well. They had lived this way of life all these years, and they were not about to change.
That's him, that's him. Let's go, get upside it, get upside it. I got you now, Reverend!
On May 7, 1955, the Reverend George Lee was followed by another car as he drove home from a speaking engagement. Suddenly, bullets rang out and Reverend Lee was shot dead. To understand how this horrifying crime could take place, and more than half a century later still be a civil rights cold case, we must go back to a time where arbitrary violence, racial oppression, and injustice against blacks were the rule of the day.
For African Americans in the 1950s in Mississippi, it could hardly have been worse. Anybody who dared to step out of line in even the slightest way, they could be killed, they could be shot, they could be, and no one would think anything about it, and nor would anything ever be done to people who are responsible.
When you had African American men coming home from the European theater where they'd seen really horrible things.
For so many of them, they became very disillusioned. They were still very patriotic, but they did not have any real understanding that the government would do something for it. They had to do it for themselves.
People became more emboldened at that time. There was this sense of uplift, and America was feeling more prosperous.
Coming out of World War II, the NAACP really transforms from a significant organization into a really massive organization.
Harry Truman in 1948 issues his first proclamation on civil rights.
You also have, the election of Adam Clayton Powell to Congress from Harlem. And so you have this steady drumbeat of successes among African Americans.
1955 was an important year. It was the year of the second Brown versus Board decision. It was the decision in which they set forth how they were going to implement the decision of 1954, which
basically outlaws segregated schools. And so that's how the White Citizens Council sprang up in the wake of that.
There was a reign of terror taking place in Mississippi. It was the fear that the Supreme Court case that had been handed down, Brown versus Board of Education, was going to impact the everyday life of the Southern way. And as a result of that, the white community took up arms.
Segregation is an institution of the South that we do not intend to see disturbed.
The mission of the White Citizens Council was very clear: maintain power and control over blacks. This meant disenfranchising eligible black voters by any means necessary. The White Citizens Council may have been called the Uptown Klan, but their tactics were as violent and dehumanizing as their white supremacist counterpart, the Ku Klux Klan. However, while the KKK would attack African Americans for the slightest reason, the White Citizens Council tended to be more concerned with what they considered threats to their economic structure. The unfair laws and rules governing black lives helped them maintain the status quo.
Basically, in 1890, Mississippi set up its state constitution to try to disenfranchise African Americans. They set up two things: literacy tests and poll taxes.
The poll tax was basically an economic barrier to voting.
They wiped the rolls clean. Blacks couldn't vote anymore. They had to come re-register, they had to pay the poll taxes every year.
As were these literacy tests that would be applied in order to register to vote. Except in this case, they would be applied very unequally.
A black Harvard-trained linguist goes to vote in Mississippi, and they give him the Constitution and he asks him to read it, and he reads it. And then they give it to him in Spanish, and he reads it. And then they give it to him in Russian, and they say, "What does this mean?" And he says, "It means Negroes can't vote in this county."
The circuit clerks had that authority, that power to basically say, you can register to vote, but you can't.
The state passed a constitutional amendment 5-1, and the new provision is this. You not only have to be able to read the Mississippi Constitution, but now you have to interpret it.
There were some rare exceptions to the no black vote stance. A few African Americans who were deemed harmless were trusted to vote. Any whites concerned about a power shift knew that this small number of black votes cast would not affect any change to their way of life.
The councils were known as the Uptown Klan, meaning what they were about was economic reprisal and publicity.
So many people that belonged to the White Citizen Council, they were bankers, they were plantation owners, they were, quote, pillars of the white community.
If you went to a civil rights meeting, somebody from the Citizens Council was in the driveway checking your license plate, and then they're going to publicize it in the newspaper the next day, and guess what? Here come the telephone calls. And here comes the bank calling in a loan.
Blacks were not allowed to vote. We wanted to demonstrate to the country and to ourselves that we wanted to be involved in decisions about politics, because in Mississippi, everything was politicized. Well, where you got a job, what kind of schools you went to, whether or not you would be arrested and farmed out to someone on a chain gang.
In 1870, the 15th Amendment granted full voting rights to all citizens of the United States, regardless of race and former condition of servitude. When Reconstruction ended in 1877 and federal troops withdrew from the South, whites in Mississippi began creating laws to exclude the black vote. By 1892, the number of black registered voters in Mississippi had drastically declined from 90% to less than 6% of those eligible. By 1955, there were even less blacks registered to vote. For the majority of eligible black voters in 1955, merely talking about voting was a matter of life and death.
With only a great deal of struggle, was George Lee able to persuade 400 of them out of 16,000 to pay the poll tax in order to qualify to register. And then when it came to trying to get them to take the next step and to register, that number dropped off substantially. And at one point, he had something like 250 who were interested in registering. With an election coming up in 1955, by the time they get to election day, the pressure has been so great, he has 22 African Americans who have said, we are going to vote.
Back then, you know, white people was pretty mean to black people, you know. If you tried to go vote or something like that, when they start voting, you know, they start chaos, you know.
You had a certain segment of people that did not want to change their way of life. They were not about to change their way of life. And we're talking about from Governor Ross Barnett on through the legislators, on through the sheriffs, on through local law enforcement, as well as the general citizens. But the law was the law.
George W. Lee was an enormously courageous man who at the same time decided that he needed to take on the cause of voting rights.
Anyone black in the 50s who registered to vote instantly became an enemy of the state.
Anybody who rebelled against that was met with retribution.
The stories that was told that was most deeply felt by me were stories of his heroism, the struggle for voting rights, and good preaching, frankly.
You were not supposed to plot and plan your liberation. And when it became clear to the white power structure that that was what was going on, that is when you saw the type of terror that was visited upon George Lee.
They struck him right back at the corner like. He drove into a house right across the street.
Immediately went over to the car to help Reverend Lee to get out of the car.
He got out of the car and was standing giving them a distress sign.
On May 7th, 1955, just before midnight, on his way home from church, George Lee, a respected minister, successful businessman, and determined activist, was ambushed and silenced. This brazen act of violence reinforced white tyranny in Belzoni, Mississippi.
I can't imagine a more repressive social climate for blacks. It was Jim Crow through and through, which also meant not only did you have your place in society, but there was also a decorum which you did not transgress.
And I lived in Belzoni all my life.
You see, most of them are farmers. And most of them, I guess, had been farmers all their life, what called Delta farmers, working on plantation. And
they shot the good Reverend in the face.
We looked at Belzoni and the entire Delta area, number one, as being the area where cotton flourished.
Work we had, only field work, no plants or nothing like that. Just picking just cotton and beans and corn. It was kind of hard back in those days, but we made it.
Though the times were rough for the average African American, some were able to prosper through land or business ownership. In addition to being a pastor, George Lee enjoyed a good life as a successful local businessman.
George W. Lee was an enormously courageous man.
He was a Baptist minister, and apparently a very good one. We know that he ran his own print shop. And we also know he was a very brave man, obviously, because Humphreys County, where Belzoni is, in 1955 had over 5,500 blacks who could register to vote. There were 0.
I knew him real well. He used to come around my mom. She cooked a lot. My mama cooked a lot. And they would come by and eat. And preachers love to eat. He was just quiet, very quiet. And he didn't talk above a whisper. He talked real soft.
George Lee was pastoring a church out from Slaughter, Mississippi. And that was during that time when Brother Lee was coming by talking about a good place. This place was for colored.
He was in the early stages of the development of the modern civil rights movement, but specifically focusing on voting rights.
So he was trying to be really the first one to register and vote. And he had been warned, as had others, that if you do this, there's going to be consequences.
Once, when Reverend Lee and an associate, Gus Courts, attempted to register to vote, the then county sheriff, Ike Shelton, refused to accept their poll tax payment. Reverend Lee and Courts bravely reported this to federal authorities and subsequently were able to cast their ballots. However, this made both men targets of the White Citizens Council.
Well, George Lee got involved in voting rights in the 1950s. He was in the Delta, he was in Belzoni, and he was registering people to vote. Well, the white establishment despised this.
Reverend Lee was an open and the earliest proponent I know of electing a black congressman from the Delta. He saw that as our opportunity and as why voter registration was important to us.
If you attempt to become a registered voter, the white people will kill you.
He needed to take on the cause of voting rights. He would have lived a long time if he had avoided that.
That night I was cleaning up, getting ready to close up, and there was some customers, whatnot.
And he's driving in his car, and suddenly gunshots ring out.
Did you hear that gun? You hear that? You hear that? And I said, hear what? And I went to the front. The car sped and went up the street.
Go, go, go! I got you now, Reverend!
And his car veers off the road.
And then he ran into the porch of this house. I looked in the car and I recognized that it was Reverend Lee. And then I kept looking and I opened the door and he was just groaning.
Reverend Lee had been shot in the neck, as far as I know of. Now, I don't know about the face, but I can see this is part of his, his Adam apples was shot away. And as he was breathing, the blood was gushing out. And at that time, the radiator bursted, and I left the car.
I got you now, Reverend!
And I just left there running. I went back into the house.
He struggled to walk and fell until a dear friend of his had been called and showed up to take him to the hospital. I think at the hospital he was pronounced dead, but the friend took him nonetheless to yet another hospital in an effort to get him treated.
It was just like a nightmare, I just hadn't seen nothing like this in this bad, and still I didn't know what had happened to him, I was just in shock almost. It was just terrible. When I closed my eyes at night, I could just see him and hear his voice, hear him groaning.
Seemingly, Reverend Lee's murderers accomplished their goals at the time. They successfully ended Lee's voter registration push, struck fear in the rest of the black community, and got away with murder.
It was a white family that lived on the right side, but he saw who it was and whatnot. And the sheriff and them came and told him to shut up. He went back to his house. He didn't live long after then.
And my mom told me, she slapped me and told me never let it come out of my mouth again.
The assassination of Reverend George W. Lee got the attention of the black press. A young activist named Medgar Evers went to Belzoni to monitor the murder investigation. By keeping the spotlight on Reverend Lee's case, Medgar Evers kept the fight for justice alive.
And basically the entire white power structure want to portray this as his mistake, his fault, an accident.
One of the details of that crime that just jumped out at me was, here's a man, obviously murdered, shot in the face.
The sheriff said that he just lost control, and then he was asked, the sheriff, well, what are all those pellet marks in his face?
The next day, the Clarion Ledger prints an article about the killing of George Lee, but they don't think it's a killing, they think it's a car accident. And the buckshot in his face is understood to be loose dental fillings.
So there was an entire fiction built up around how George W. Lee was killed, and as a result, it was never really investigated.
The major paper here, the Belzoni Banner, and they have no entries whatsoever about Reverend Lee.
George Lee was a very prominent member of that community. Surely the next week we would have all kinds of coverage of this awful crime. There's not a word about him. I looked in the next week, nothing. The week after, nothing, not even an obituary. And this is in his hometown newspaper, so you can see how some people just wanted this to go away.
Details about Reverend Lee's death were fictionalized, and witnesses were kept silent in an attempt to make the murder go away quietly. Nonetheless, a brave few saw to it that the crime remained on the country's collective conscience.
In Mississippi, what you find is a hardening of sentiment against African Americans.
African Americans began to really break free in the 1940s especially, when these African American veterans like Medgar Evers came home from war. And he knew George Lee well, was friends with him. He came up to investigate.
Medgar Evers, to a lot of us, was a real-life hero. He was somebody who was a fearless leader of the NAACP.
And so whenever a killing would take place, it would trigger action by Medgar. In some ways, he was kind of acting like a police detective. He would pick up clues, talk to witnesses, talk to this person here, and he would collect this information, try to get, obviously, law enforcement to do something about it, but also he was sharing it with the NAACP nationally as well. Even if they weren't able to actually bring about prosecutions in these cases, he was documenting what took place.
The person who first spotted his talents as an organizer is Dr. T.R.M. Howard.
Another civil rights leader to speak out and draw attention to the murder of Reverend Lee was Medgar Evers' mentor, Dr. T.R.M. Howard. At the time, he lived in Mound Bayou, Mississippi, where he founded the Regional Council of Negro Leadership in 1951.
Reverend George Lee, who was slain on May the 7th, 1955, was a personal friend of mine. It grieves my heart when I know that these things can take place in the South, and while these killers are widely known in the communities where these crimes took place, up until this very hour, nobody has been arrested because of the death of these men. Therefore, I think that we should stop going across the sea talking about men's inhumanity to man as long as we have these damnable crimes in Mississippi and the rest of the
country. Everybody was just distraught like me and just couldn't believe it, that this had happened,
What we are talking about in this point in time is terrorism. And so the response that you see among African Americans is best understood through that lens.
Yeah, I feel real bad over it. I was sorry that he ever came here. That's the way I felt about it.
For African Americans, Mississippi was once one of the most repressive states. Today, Mississippi has more African American elected officials than any other state in America. However, when the state's dark past is revisited, tension still arises.
That the situation is different. It's not the same in Mississippi now as it was in the 50s. And yet, as I'm telling them that, I don't get from many black folks, but notably white folks in this state, that the state has changed. And part of that saddens me because I suspect it hasn't changed in some fundamental ways.
There were clearly a system set up by where I'm totally superior, you're totally inferior, I'm the master, you do what I say, when I say, how I say.
When you start talking about the violence directed at African Americans, you have to understand that the South has a particularly violent history anyway. So this is the most violent segment of a generally violent history.
Historically, the black church has been more than a place of worship. It was also a force of political and social change. Unfortunately, in the Jim Crow South of the 1950s, the struggle for equality wasn't easy. And even a man of God was not safe from the inhumanity of racism.
People went to church, of course, and church was a big part of the cultural life.
As a result of having the programs at the churches, then they would say to different people, I need to talk to you once church service is over. And they would then begin to talk a little bit in groups.
The church is the only institution that is mainly owned and controlled by African Americans. When you see the burgeoning of the civil rights movement, is really no different. This goes back to a tradition, even in the 19th century, coming out of slavery. You have, the black church right there, and as the first kind of natural institution through which leadership is cultivated.
We always think of civil rights, we think of Dr. King and the Black Baptist tradition, and the preaching as part of the movement.
You have to think when you are in assembly, where you're fighting for justice and you're fighting for the human rights of people whose human rights have been sorely challenged, you have to think back to the establishment of systems like the theology of liberation.
With the troubles of the world.
The church it's a shelter, it's a place to organize, it's a place to draw recruits from, and it's, of course, a powerful rhetorical tradition.
Mainly what they were doing is trying to get people to go downtown and register to vote. Going from house to house sometimes, asking people to come to meetings, and there were a lot of meetings. These same towering men were trying to get ordinary people in the community to register to vote. Now, to do that, they had to try to overcome a massive, long-lasting fear of doing anything that white folks said you shouldn't be doing. And they had clearly said black people shouldn't be registering to vote.
You know, Reverend Lee loved to go downtown, and they just stand around and talk. The pastors, the preachers and stuff, standing out on the corners and talking. They definitely didn't want you talking about freedom, voting, and stuff like that.
Before and throughout the Civil Rights era, the black church was a sanctuary for African Americans. Overlooked and demeaned in their daily lives, in their house of worship, African Americans were respected and in positions of power. It was no wonder the seeds of the Civil Rights Movement were cultivated within the black church.
Mississippi stands for the most courageous, the most creative civil rights movement in America.
You had George Lee, you had Gus Courts, you had Medgar Evers, you had Dr. T.R.M. Howard. A number of these guys who really got involved in pushing to register people to vote.
There was a sense that something good is going to happen, that there's a sense of momentum, there's a real sense of possibility. I don't think anyone could have imagined how much resistance there was going to be, and there was.
These people understood that there had to be a fight, and they were willing to wage it, and they did. And some of them paid the ultimate penalty for it.
Under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI received much criticism for its handling of civil rights murder cases. In most cases, the FBI seemed to respond only when under pressure from African American leaders and other influential advocates. Frustrated over the stalling of justice in the cases of Emmett Till and personal friends Reverend George Lee and Lamar Smith, Dr. T.R.M. Howard embarked upon a national speaking tour. A highly public dispute between Howard and the FBI's J. Edgar Hoover resulted, after Howard accused Hoover of being slow to act concerning the murders.
The crux of your complaint, as I gather it, is that I have made false and irresponsible charges against the FBI in connection with the murders of George W. Lee, Lamar Smith, and Emmett Till, all of whom were killed in Mississippi during 1955. I am sure that you will understand that these murders, all of which have gone unpunished, have excited genuine concern on the part of millions of Americans. I regret that this controversy has arisen between us, since it tends to obscure the fact that the real issue in the South and in the nation and in the world, for that matter, is not our differences as to FBI action or inaction, but the fact that American citizens are being wantonly murdered in Mississippi and that their murderers are going unpunished. Sincerely yours, Dr. T.R.M. Howard.
Though the murder of Reverend George Lee shook the town of Belzoni, his friend and civil rights activist Gus Courts continued the mission, even after threats against his own life.
Yeah, Gus Courts is one of my favorite men of the movement. He was in Humphreys County. He had seen his friend George Lee get murdered. He had resigned from being president of the local NAACP, but he was still involved. He used his grocery store as a place for people to pay their poll tax. The Citizens Council comes and warns him, you either cut this out or we're going to shut you down and you're probably going to be next, like your friend. And he wouldn't close up shop.
Reverend Lee was working closely with Gus Courts, who also came under enormous pressure and was basically run out of town.
I know that he was also a man deeply involved in the voter registration campaign. I know that a lot of people treat him sort of like they did the living, what I want to call it, image of Reverend Lee. I think Gus Courts is a man who simply stood up and decided to say that I'm not afraid, or even if I am, I'm going to do what I have to do.
He did it only to help his people in Humphreys County. They shot him. He almost died on the way to Mound Bayou because they weren't going to treat him probably in Jackson or anywhere else, so he barely makes it to Mound Bayou. He heals. And then what's kind of sad is he relocates up in Chicago. And later he testifies before Congress as to what happened to him in Humphreys County and what happened to George Lee and how he was threatened by the Citizens Council just because he wanted to register to vote.
And to read his testimony before the United States Senate about what happened in Mississippi is truly chilling. He was being grilled as if he was a perpetrator.
Although most of Belzoni, black and white alike, suspected 2 known members of the White Citizen Council, the local prosecutor refused to take the case to the grand jury. The prosecutor decided the evidence against the men purely circumstantial, and justice was delayed for Reverend George Lee.
I welcome the FBI and any other state or local official to take these cases seriously, because an injustice done in the past is still an injustice and it must be remedied.
The FBI can do a whole lot in terms of sharing the documents that it has, not only for scholars, but for families. And it seems as if what we're getting out of Washington, D.C. in these last several years is the FBI's willingness to say, we want to work with people and organizations to solve these cases, and we're willing to let our files and our agents help in that process.
Today, a new spirit of cooperation exists within the FBI ranks. Current agents use the latest technology to reinvestigate the civil rights cold cases. Sometimes, they even work with the original investigating agents. The FBI also hopes that assistance from the public and other organizations will aid them in finding justice for these heart-wrenching crimes.
The success in Mississippi by the FBI and local authorities in bringing some of these cases back to trial has been because of the diligence of the FBI agents and also the prosecutors that really desire to bring these people to justice.
I do believe that you can't have reconciliation before there's justice. I think to try to say, well, let's forget everything that's in the past and just move on to the future it's not realistic and it's not fair, because so much of what happened in the past hasn't been openly acknowledged.
You can't have forgiveness without justice. You can't have reconciliation without real truth.
I'm optimistic that, in fact, the FBI wants to be a part of the healing, because so often it was part of the problem.
We know there are instances where the individuals have been identified, but it's also the question of what are the repercussions for pursuing justice.
There's a certain segment of people in Mississippi that I know of who do not want to come forward and assist us, meaning the FBI and local law enforcement, in some of these old cases. They're fearful that they will harm their family if they come forward now.
I didn't express my feeling. I was afraid.
Well, at the time, the people didn't know that I was one of the witnesses, because I didn't say anything too much else about it.
This code of silence, you call it, I'm somewhat saddened by it. I say the situation is a far more complex one for me than it seems.
I think on the part of white people, a lot of that silence had to do with guilt. And on the part of black people, a lot of that silence had to do with fear. And it was a well-justified fear.
You have to remember, in those days, you were dealing with people who would kill and never think anything about it. Didn't bother them. We know that from our interviews. And I'm going to be very blunt. They would say, look, killing that person meant nothing to me. That didn't bother me to beat that man to death. Didn't bother me to burn that black church. Didn't bother me to beat those people as they came out of church. Didn't bother me one bit. Well, it didn't bother us to take them to task and see that justice was done.
The justice sought by the FBI and the families of the victims in the civil rights cold cases is just one part of the healing process. Some believe that by revealing and recording the truth about these crimes, future generations will never repeat the bloody past.
It's up to younger people to, so to speak, pick up the baton. I think it's important that they dig for information. They also need generally to educate themselves about those periods.
And I think it needs to be done through the schools. I think it can be done through the churches. We have the infrastructure. We have this massive educational system. And if we're not educating people about who we were historically, you can't really explain who we are today.
I grant to young people that your generation is yours to live, but your history is deeply embedded in the past somewhere, and you got to uncover that. You got to know that. If you don't, as the great philosopher Santayana says, you are doomed to repeat that history.
The South, in some respects, is still the South. The challenges faced in the 50s are still challenges we face today.
I don't believe that we can overcome racism without the recipients of that kind of privilege coming forward and saying we don't want it. We don't want to be the recipients of hate. We don't want to get everything we get because we're white. We want to stand up and say that's wrong.
Closure always has to be, in my opinion, has to be both personal and historical for a people. And the historical gotta be a truth that is now told that all the community can know and hopefully to publicize. And that might bring us to the sense that that was an era, as important as it is. And the people who were the activists, they've done their part, and now we move on from there.
Closure for the family members of the victims should be receive some level of restitution for the state's involvement.
Well, to the families, it would mean everything to know that there is justice. But I think also to the families, just having the opportunity to tell the story of a George Lee, a Lamar Smith, a Willie Edwards. That in itself is going to provide a certain level of catharsis, just to say the nation may now know this person's name and know something about that person's story.
For many, the pain of the past persists, even today, even through the silence.
I don't think that we are, as a society, really eager to talk about these wounds. I think that there's still a great deal of reluctance, even among some African Americans.
I got you now, Reverend!
It do affect me because I don't like looking at pictures now, like movies. Whereas you had a lot of segregation during the time and the way that black people was treated.
I prayed and went on, with my life. It's just happened. But I do think about it. Sometime around here, it just come across my mind. I don't worry about it like I did when it first happened, because when it first happened, it's just like somebody in my family.
When we look at it now, there's a reason why there's no statute of limitations for murder.
People tend to think of justice as a one-sided thing. It's not one-sided at all. It brings us all together as a people.
The evidence has been clear. We now prosecuted successfully the murderer of Medgar Evers. We prosecuted the murderers successfully of the 3 civil rights workers. We also prosecuted the murderers of 2 young boys in Franklin County recently. And there are several more. The Smith case and the Reverend Lee case that we have to do while we still have people around associated with the crime. And that's why the urgency of getting this Emmett Till Justice Bill passed.
People say, well, why should you bother? It's been so long. But it's just as long as it is, that's how evil it is.
And white people have a chance to help us learn as much as we can about what happened to Reverend Lee.
Is there anyone left, that was involved in it or whatever? But I feel like they still should be punished.
For me, all of those who participated that is still alive, that they be prosecuted and convicted.
Without proper resolution, the blood of Reverend George Lee and the other victims of civil rights murders will forever remain a stain on humanity. Seeing a need to address the wrongs of the past, in September of 2008, the Senate passed the Emmett Till Bill to provide $10 million annually over 10 years to further investigate and pursue every avenue of justice in the civil rights cold cases.
It's that reputation that the South lived with for so long that a lot of us are committed to trying to change. One of those ways that we're trying to change it is with the Emmett Till Justice Bill that would allow the FBI the resources necessary to track down any of those individuals who might still be alive who are associated with some of those killings.
Better late than never. So it seemed as if they are now attempting to make up for a little lost time.
I would say to the families that you're not alone. As we study the facts and gather evidence and participate in projects like this and campaigns against this kind of terror, we lift up the names of your loved ones, who are our loved ones.
Human beings are human beings. Out of one blood, God created all nations. I say, I can bleed out there, you can bleed out there. You cannot tell one man's blood from another.
Reverend George Lee is considered by many the first martyr in the civil rights struggle in America. His name is also listed first on the Civil Rights Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. His death was one in a string of vicious incidents in Mississippi during the bloody year of 1955. That same year, just 3 months later, Emmett Till was murdered in Mississippi. Later in December, Reverend Lee's friend, Gus Courts, was shot and seriously wounded. We hope this tragic story will motivate surviving witnesses to come forward, galvanize the general public to demand further investigation of this murder in black and white. If you have any leads on Reverend George Lee's murder or any other civil rights cold case, please visit TV1online.com to help justice prevail.
Mm-hmm.